Where to begin with a game like this, with such significance behind it? Well, how about the intro to Final Fantasy VII? Three little notes, and then those echoing footsteps, with no idea how important a role they would play. Small hints of Midgar and its tone as we zoom out to the Mako around Shinra, that epic crescendo, the scale of this 3D world for the PS1. And then the zoom back in, with the train just kicking in every now and then as we move into bombing mission. Bad ass, what an intro. Then Avalanche shows up, and the stylized character models show up, which might look dated now, but not once bothering me in current year, and launching you straight into a fight as well. And this is it, Final Fantasy VII, not even skipping a beat in the music, and keeping you fully involved in whatever epic adventure that you're about to embark on. 2020 was my first time ever playing Final Fantasy VII, mostly because the remake was hyped up, and after watching a playthrough of that, I had to see what the original was like. At first, this video was going to compare the two, but they're such vastly different games overall that I'd be doing an injustice to both if I were to do that, so we'll just be talking 1997 release and the Steam version, which is the one that I played. And I have to say, this is one of those games that's always hyped up so much with you have to play this sort of statements and things like that, and rarely do I ever come out in agreement after doing so when it comes to this sort of a thing, but I must this time, I don't have a choice. You have to play it too. Even if you think it looks old or whatever, it really is just a masterpiece. It holds up, so let me explain why. First and foremost, the soundtrack is what spoke to me so well. I just mentioned Bombing Mission, which I couldn't get out of my head for weeks, but the whole OST is full of incredible music, which you'll hopefully be hearing throughout this video. I think everyone at this point has heard the generic battle theme Fighting, but it can't go without a mention because of just how iconic it is. FF7 has quite a wide variety of tone to its music. First up we've got the super funky stuff like Underneath the Rotting Pizza and Oppressed People, which are both absolute bangers if you're into bass, like myself, closely followed by the Turks theme, which follows a group of characters around the game and is both welcome and not when it kicks in. Which says already quite a lot, really, that just a piece of music can evoke a feeling like that, which, yeah, that is the point of music, but you just don't expect it in games most of the time. And then of course you've got character themes, like the Turk stuff, like, say, Kate Sith's theme, which is good, and it's about the only good thing I'll have to say about that character. Or how about Barret's and Tifa's themes, which managed to nail their personalities so well. Or Cid's theme, which is another one worth giving a nod to. I could go on about the whole soundtrack, in fact, it's truly phenomenal and you should at least give it a listen if you've got time. Special mentions for me go to Crazy Motorcycle for being such a fun, upbeat and fast tempo song that goes so well with the situation it plays in, Genova for being the best track in the game bar none, Fight Me, closely followed by Genova Absolute, which sadly only played for me for a very short time, for reasons. And then of course we've got One Winged Angel, which I think is a little overrated, but I will say that hearing it in context in the game finally after so many years was just extremely satisfying. And yeah, it is still good. I'll let you have that one. And finally we have Life Stream, which is just hinted at in the intro, those three notes that I mentioned. This track, man, between this and Aerith's theme, it's a very tough thing to describe. I do not tend to get emotionally attached to characters in media, but something here really managed to touch me, and these two tracks still remind me of those particular moments, those memories of parts that they play, and I genuinely feel things listening to them, which is the absolute highest praise I could possibly give to a piece of music. Well done, Nobuo Uematsu. I probably have butchered your name. I apologise. So yes, I could gush about that music for a long while or just get lost re-listening to it all again, so let's move on. Real quick, I should mention again that I played the Steam version of the game, which for some reason does not bind sensible controls to a controller. Luckily, there is a mod that you can apply to fix it very easily, giving you understandable button prompts on a screen instead of assist or switch, which you'll never remember what the hell that applies to if you're like me and just get thrust into a minigame with no idea what the hell you're doing. There's a link for that in the description, super easy to do, no problems. I did initially struggle with a few things, and the game does suffer from some tropes of games at the time it came out. The graphics in particular are something I had to get used to, which normally isn't so much of a hurdle for me, and while character models are weirdly blocky and quite silly, they do manage to convey a lot of meaning in their oddly stiff movements, often to great comedic effect, which I found myself laughing out loud to quite a lot. The environments, though, were the main struggle. It's not always clear where you can and can't move, or where the game wants you to go, or where you can potentially screen transition, for example, which parts are foreground or background, or in the worst cases, where you can initiate some kind of a jump to another piece of scenery. There are sometimes little triangles that you can toggle on to help you with this, but for the most part it was trial and error and running into a lot of walls to figure out what I was looking at, especially in Midgar and the Undercity. The worst examples of that were the Northern Crater and climbing from Sector 7 upwards. I did eventually get used to it though, but it took a noticeable while to do so, and therefore I had to mention it. My first Final Fantasy experience was number 8, which I played the hell out of as a kid, so I am somewhat used to those kind of pre-rendered backgrounds. The graphical jump between these two games is actually massive, even for the PS1. But that's not at all to say that 7's graphics are bad. While Midgar ranges from brown dump in the Undercity to grey metropolis above, you're in and out of those areas pretty quickly, and there's even quite a large amount of variation there. Don Corneo's mansion sticks out like a sore thumb, appropriately. The sewers are memorable, surprisingly. The train graveyard was another standout and deserves a mention, even for being so short compared to the remake. And then there's Aerith's house, Wall Market, Sector 7, the Mako reactors, and the Shinra building. And that's just the first 3 hours or so FF7 is packed full of places to see. Which neatly brings me on to the pacing of the game, I think. Having seen the remake before I played the original, I was shocked to see how much they dragged out Midgar in the remake. I was perhaps the same amount of shocked that they whizzed through it in the original, since there's so many themes and ideas to explore and they totally don't give you any time to do so before throwing you out into the overworld map. Like, I could stand to spend quite a bit more time getting to know Avalanche. I felt like I knew Jesse, Biggs and Wedge a lot more than I would have, just because I have seen the remake first, but it's hard to judge how important they were originally. Barret and Tifa consider them so the player should too perhaps, but it's hard to judge when you only really see them for a little bit. The pace, though, doesn't really let up for most of the game. Once you're out of Midgar, you're constantly being pushed towards the next objective, which is actually very welcome for my preconceptions of a JRPG. Normally I'd be worrying about how much grind they want me to do and what power level I'm supposed to be at, what items I need and what magics I need and all that kind of stuff, but even with the constant fast pace of travel and story, I never felt anywhere near underpowered. In fact, most of the time I felt the opposite. Enemies just never posed any kind of a challenge or a threat, and giving me access to extremely powerful enemy skills through that particular materia basically trivialized a lot of the game. Between White Wind being a massive heal, Big Guard being haste and protection on a low MP cost, and Magic Hammer absorbing MP to continue using these expensive spells, it ended up being quite a cakewalk. Now yes, I do realise that a lot of that could be attributed to my completionist playstyle though. I do imagine that skipping a lot of the stuff that I didn't would change things, and not having some levelled up materia might mix things up, but for the most part, basic attacks, heals and the occasional bit of elemental magic is all you really need. Which is, for me, a bit of a shame, because the materia system in FF7 is actually really damn cool. You start out with basic spells like Fire 1, Ice 1, Cure 1, that sort of stuff, you know the deal. And as you beat combat encounters, you gain XP for character levels and AP for Materia advancement. After gaining enough AP, you'll unlock a higher tier spell from each Materia that you're leveling up. So you'll get stuff like Fire 2 and then Fire 3, or Cure 2 and then Regen. Or in the case of others, perhaps different utility spells to counter status effects or do wild kinds of damage. Regen, by the way, regenerates your health over time and is so strong to have early on, and it was especially useful in the battle square. Really big fan of Regen, great effect. But what makes the system so interesting to me though is how you slot those spells together. You can link support materia to all sorts of things to augment those spell effects. All materia will make a spell do less damage, but instead will affect all the targets on the field instead of just one. So you could potentially cast Cure on your whole team in one round, or hit all of the enemies with a poison spell. And those links in your gear only ever come in pairs, so you're limited in what combos you can set up. But with some forethought, and a bit of gaming the system perhaps, you can pull off some insane stuff. For example, one of the most impressive things that I thought I'd come up with is if you have enough slots, you could link a Quadra Magic with a Gravity Materia, and then HP Absorb with another Gravity Materia, and then a counter with a Mime Command Materia, and finally throw in a W Magic command in there too. What this results in is you casting Gravity, or any other substituted spell in there to be honest, 8 times in a row thanks to Quadra Magic and W Magic, that's 2 times 4 casts, and then that absorbs all the HP damage that you do to heal back up, spending a bunch of MP up front, and then automatically countering an enemy attack with that exact combo if you get hit at, and here's the best part, 0 MP cost from that point forwards. Effectively, this makes you capable of spamming huge spell chains at no cost. This is pretty much the strategy I used for the endgame weapon bosses, but with summons instead. Sadly though, Emerald and Ruby were the only 2 bosses in the game that needed such quote genius strategy, because everything else dies so quickly when you're hasted and doing max attack damage. Thanks Big Guard. But there's all kinds of loopy genius stuff you can do with materia linking, making yourself immune to certain damage, able to use commands on top of others, like perhaps stealing on your basic attacks, or inflicting blind on your basic attacks, or any number of things like that. It's actually brilliant. So I love the system, but it wasn't fully explored enough for me. Still, very good. I see the massive amount of potential that a materia system has in FF7, it could just perhaps have been expanded a little bit more. The only other issue I had with the advancement system for materia is how long it can take to level them up. There's so much gear in the game that can do so many different things, but I never used any of the many weapons and accessories that I found, stole and bought throughout the game because I just didn't need any materia equipped and just wanted to keep my double growth items for the very few materia that I did want to level up. Anyway, not to get too bogged down with mechanics, there's still so many other great things to talk about. The summons are pretty cool though. It was nice to see their animations in game finally and to see where the improved Final Fantasy VIII ones came from. And there's so many of them in FF7 too, I wouldn't know where to start ranking them, but of course Knights of the Round obviously gets a special mention for being the longest animation ever, and yes, you can W summon 2 of them in a row too while the enemy just has to sit there and take it, plus you can then counter mime on all 3 party members so that the game forgets how many casts it needs to then repeat on Emerald Weapon, which is kinda hilarious but also kinda disappointing sometimes. Also, just a side note, why are there 3 different versions of Bahamut? Just throwing that out there. And one last thing about the pacing are the minigames. The Gold Saucer was a massive distraction, and while fun for a little bit, it definitely outstayed its welcome because I needed so much stuff from there. The Battle Square also, while a decent challenge for understanding the mechanics and setting yourself up cleverly enough, became a real drag to grind through to unlock Omnislash early on. And yeah, while you can cheese the slots in the square to limit your disadvantages, it was still a very long process. Maybe I'd recommend just waiting till late game to unlock that limit break, while you're better equipped to steamroll that minigame. The other minigame that was a total waste of time was Fort Condor. If you want all of the rewards for this, then be prepared to walk back and forth across the entire overworld map over and over again after each minor story beat to totally interrupt your flow. Special mention there goes to Junon Harbour, where you have to go into a cutscene, go back to Fort Condor, back to Junon Harbour, into another cutscene, only to walk immediately back to Fort Condor. Why? But anyway, FF7 injects minigames all over the place throughout the game, which keeps the gameplay interesting in otherwise non-interactive places, like keeping check of your temperature at Gaia's Cliff, resuscitating a girl at, before mentioned, Junon Harbour, snowboarding, piano playing, motorcycle chasing, statue stealthing, submarine hunting and chocobo racing, among others. There's so much variety packed into this game, often in one-off situations, but they were all pretty fun to shake things up, and hilarious in the case of the Junon Army Parade, which I messed up probably like 4 or 5 times. I suppose I should probably talk about the story too, to round things out. As the JRPG trope goes, you start out dealing with some local threat for somewhat basic reasons. Cloud's a merc and he wants to get paid. Simple. Barret and the crew, on the other hand, hired him to help with some freedom fighting, which is a huge, planet-worthy cause in their eyes. The big overall evil, Shinra Corporation, has been using reactors throughout the city of Midgar to siphon off Mako from the planet, producing power and resulting in all the technology and advancement that you see throughout the game. But it turns out that Mako is basically keeping the planet together though, and using it for power like this is essentially killing the entire planet's life stream off. So a couple of blown up reactors later, and an enormous retaliation from Shinra leads our party right into their headquarters, where Cloud discovers that Sephiroth is still alive, apparently, which is news to him since he was the one that actually killed him. Oh yeah, and Sephiroth is pretty much the ultimate evil created by Shinra as a super soldier that ended up going rogue. But yeah, there's a lot of details that I'll have to just skip here and just kind of assume that you know a little bit about what's going on. I remember a particularly hilarious scene in the headquarters when running up the 60+ staircases of that Shinra building, where Tifa calls Barret a hard R word that I'm not going to repeat here, which is probably jarring to modern audiences, but I just found it really funny. And I often found the writing to be a mix of light-hearted and often casual chatter, then opposed by really deep concepts and hard-hitting commentary about the state of things in their world, which of course has real-life reflections occasionally. I was really into it, rather quickly in fact, and was always keen on pushing the story forwards in order to get more answers to these newer questions that would then reveal themselves going forwards. So after the Midgar escape, you're set free in the overworld map for the game and can suddenly appreciate just how much game there really is to play ahead of you. I really didn't expect it, even though I should have, because I've seen parts of the game before, and for the most part the story will take you almost everywhere on every continent, with a few optional secrets along the way that you'll have to explore for yourself. Immediately after leaving Midgar, you'll arrive at the town of Calm, and then the story from that point on just keeps getting better, with the main characters driving it forwards with their own motivations. The game is subtle sometimes in not telling you certain bits of information, but letting you know that the characters are either just as out of the loop as you are as the player, or intentionally withholding information from you. Cloud, for example, is an unreliable narrator, and you'll notice that Tifa picks up on that very quickly but doesn't allow herself to pass any judgment without letting Cloud figure stuff out for himself, and therefore the player too. It builds their relationship in a respectable way that I enjoyed a lot, and it keeps that tension and intrigue quite high throughout the game. Of course though, things do eventually escalate as they would in a JRPG, and you'll go from place to place using newer and different ways of travel, each with their own restrictions. Walking, chocobo catching and riding to avoid a giant sand snake, a buggy that can travel across sand and rivers, a plane that can cross seas, and then finally a full-on airship. Of course, it's a Final Fantasy game. And the pace at which these are introduced is also, for me, very well balanced. It never let me get bored of travel, which is nice, because you travel a lot in this game. So there's escalation, and with it comes reason as for why we're escalating the threats themselves, the bosses that you have to fight. There's story twists, there's character development, ideologies, tension, surprise, pure joy, and some genuinely sad moments too. I think one of these is probably the most spoiled gaming moment of all time, or at least one of them, so I'm not too worried about saying this, but if you are, then skip to the timestamp on screen right now. Yeah, obviously, it's Aerith's death scene. How could it not be? I've not even talked about her yet, in fact I've barely talked about any of the characters, but Aerith is a character that endears herself not only to Cloud very quickly, because she's such a good foil to his military-like attitude with her playfulness and eagerness, but also to you as the player. She gets on with everyone, and up until this point in games, you'd just never expect the story to simply kill off one of your main party members for good, because Phoenix Downs exist. Now I knew this was going to happen going into the game, how could you not? It's spoiled all over the place. It was no surprise when it happened, but there were parts that were surprising, that did build up that moment and made it surpass my expectations of how it plays out. Not having full control of Cloud just before it, fighting and struggling against the controls, trying my absolute hardest to not do what the game inevitably wants me to do, and then that moment of clarity right before, thinking that maybe I don't have to kill her, maybe I can solve this, maybe I can avoid this naively. And then the whole cutscene of it happening, playing out before me, helplessly watching, and then her theme song kicks in, and before you can even react properly and get the crew to react and understand what is happening right now and why, Sephiroth is gone, and then you're in another boss fight with Jenova, but instead of her epic theme starting up, Aerith's theme just keeps playing. Overall, this was such a simple decision to play with the music like that, but I just didn't expect it, and I wasn't prepared to associate emotion with it in such a strong way. And while the cutscene afterwards looks dated, it's still striking that they made it significant enough to give it a whole cutscene for itself. There's a lot of events in the game that don't get such treatment. Aerith's theme then after this point will sometimes make recurring appearances throughout the game at moments of apprehension, or when someone makes a triumphant speech, when they're trying to raise spirits, or at those moments of reflection, just to remind you of her, and just to remind you why you're in this situation and what you're fighting for, and I found it working to elicit those emotions from me, even through this janky animation, old graphics, and simplistic text. It really did work. Which brings us back to what I said right at the start of this video, the significance of those 3 little notes, and the way in which I now have those memories and experiences associated so strongly with those 2 music pieces. I'm not ashamed to say that they still strike me with some real weight, even now just talking about them. And the game just keeps on giving after that too. There's so much more to do and to play beyond that point in the story. For example, it took me until the Medial arc, after a hilarious cutscene involving a wheelchair and the huge Materia, to eventually fully understand the story and realise why a lot of the characters' motivations were as they were, and everything finally coming to a head and receiving proper moments of realisation. I think it not only holds up to today's standards, I think in fact it's outright better than a lot of modern examples of storytelling. Now, as I said before, I've barely spoken about the party characters themselves as a part of that story, because there's just so much to say already, and I'm sure each one of you listening will resonate differently with any number of these characters. I loved Red 13's story arc, but unfortunately it was just really short, ending at Cosmo Canyon, pretty much. Cid is the angriest character I've ever seen in a game, which is partially hilarious and also kinda sad really. Vincent is super duper edgy edgelord man. Yuffie is, well, you know, and Cloud truly does develop over the course of the game, which is nice. Barret remains a true bro the whole time, and while he does soften up too, he's always a reliable dude. I almost forgot about Tifa too, with her extreme fists of fury and kick-ass fighting moves and her limit break. I absolutely love her limit break and how it evolves throughout the game, and I deeply enjoyed her character arc throughout. And Cait Sith exists, I guess. Unsurprisingly, I'm not really a fan of Cait Sith's comedy, but he has his moments, especially in the Temple of the Ancients. You know the one part, and if you don't, then well, I won't spoil it. Though, I will give him this, he does have an extremely strong limit break if you know how to manipulate the slots. Which reminds me, I never really mentioned limit breaks either. See, this game is huge, man. There's almost always a good reason that a game reaches such widespread recognition and gains a reputation like this, but it's always good to find out for yourself if those reasons hold up. Final Fantasy VII not only holds up, but it managed to surpass my expectations even as a skeptic. This game stands tall as an absolute giant in its field and deserves its reputation as one of the best games of all time. I will join the rest of the crowd when I say that you need to play this game, unquestionably. I've been MagicalMike, and I'm Quids in with this game. Cheers.